If I told you that the global trade system, often described as the safest and most stable system the modern world has ever built, is quietly breaking down, and that most Americans have no idea it's happening, would you believe me? And what if I told you this isn't a future risk, not a theory, not a worst-case scenario, but a process that has already begun, with warning signs visible in plain sight? Today, I'm going to give you just 3 numbers. Only 3. Because if you truly understand how the modern world functions, these 3 numbers should make you uncomfortable. The first number is 12. 12 commercial vessels seized in a single coordinated operation. The second number is 40. 40 Russian naval assets deployed at the same time across 3 separate maritime regions. And the third number is $3 billion, the estimated value of the ships and cargo that are now sitting under Russian control. But the real question isn't what Russia did. The real question is how Russia became able to do it. And the more disturbing question is whether we, collectively, showed them the way. In Washington, the response has been familiar anger, sharp statements, emergency meetings behind closed doors, but I can tell you this much with confidence. This time, the shock is real. And when U.S. policymakers are genuinely surprised, it usually means something went wrong much earlier at the strategic level. Over the past several weeks, what happened in the waters surrounding Russia was not an impulsive decision, and it was not an emotional reaction. It was the execution of a plan that had been prepared carefully and patiently, waiting for the right moment. In the Black Sea, the Baltic approaches, and the Arctic shipping lanes, Russian forces moved almost simultaneously. Oil and LNG tankers were stopped, boarded, and redirected to Russian ports. These included American-operated vessels and ships sailing under Allied flags. And in every case, Russia presented legal justifications so carefully constructed that Western legal experts are still debating their interpretation. This is where many people instinctively ask a simple question. Doesn't international maritime law prevent this? On paper, yes. In practice, that depends on who has the power to enforce the rules and who is willing to do it. This is the point where the real weakness of the modern global system becomes impossible to ignore. Rules only function as rules when they are applied consistently. The moment rules are turned into weapons, they stop being about protection and start being about control. And that takes us back to late 2022, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when the West rolled out what was described as the most aggressive sanctions regime in modern history. Russia was cut off from the SWIFT system, central bank assets were frozen, and most importantly, an oil price cap was imposed. The idea was simple in theory: allow Russian oil to stay on the market, but only at prices low enough to drain Moscow's ability to fund its war. In Washington, this was framed as smart, calibrated policy. In Moscow, it was seen very differently as a declaration that the West believed it had the authority to dictate the terms of global energy trade. Russia could sell oil, but only on Western terms. Western insurance, Western shipping networks, Western financial systems. Break those rules and your ships don't sail. Russia did not respond immediately. Instead, it adjusted. It redirected exports toward Asia. It expanded Arctic shipping capacity beyond what most analysts believed was possible. It built alternative payment systems designed to operate outside Western control. These were not short-term economic fixes. They were preparations for a moment when Russia would decide it no longer needed Western permission to operate. And by the end of 2024, that moment arrived. By the end of 2024, the situation reached a turning point. And notably, that shift did not arrive through a formal announcement, a presidential address, or a diplomatic warning, but through concrete actions at sea that fundamentally altered long-standing assumptions about how global commerce operates. U.S. and allied naval forces began stopping and inspecting oil and LNG tankers suspected of transporting Russian crude above the agreed price cap. And this is a critical detail. These boardings were not conducted in Russian territorial waters, but in international maritime zones, areas that for decades had symbolized freedom of navigation and neutrality. This immediately raises a difficult question. If international waters are no longer insulated from enforcement actions tied to economic policy, then what does international really mean in practice? Officially, the justification was sanctions compliance. But in reality, something more consequential was happening. Economic pressure had crossed a visible threshold and was now being reinforced by physical force. Moscow took careful note of every inspection, every boarding, every assertion of authority exercised by Western naval forces over vessels Russia considered legitimate commercial traffic. There was no immediate retaliation, no dramatic escalation, just meticulous documentation and quiet preparation. Then, in mid-December, an incident occurred that provided the legal catalyst Russia needed. In northern waters, an American-operated tanker collided with a Russian research vessel, resulting in the deaths of several Russian crew members. Washington described the incident as a tragic accident. Moscow claimed the tanker was equipped with surveillance technology and demanded that the vessel and its crew return for a criminal investigation. When that demand was refused, Russia formally classified the case, not as a military confrontation, but as a criminal matter. That distinction was crucial. By framing the event as a law enforcement issue rather than an act of war, Russia created a legal pathway that allowed it to act while maintaining the position that it was not escalating militarily. What followed was neither chaotic nor improvised. Russian naval units moved nearly simultaneously across multiple maritime regions. 12 commercial vessels were stopped, boarded, and escorted into Russian ports. The crews aboard those ships, people who had left home expecting routine commercial voyages, were suddenly reclassified as material witnesses in ongoing investigations. Officially, they were not hostages. Functionally, they became leverage in a geopolitical confrontation they never chose to enter. This is where the broader implications become impossible to ignore. If the United States and its allies can board ships in international waters to enforce sanctions, then on what basis can Russia be told it cannot do the same under its own legal claims? If Western economic rules can be enforced through naval power, why should Moscow not apply its regional military superiority to enforce its interpretation of maritime security? This is strategic mirroring in its purest form, and it forces Western policymakers to confront an uncomfortable reality. A system in which one side dictates rules globally without facing reciprocal vulnerability cannot remain stable indefinitely. The consequences of this shift extend well beyond Russia and the United States. Every nation that has long viewed Western maritime dominance with resentment is watching closely. China is watching. Iran is watching. Regional powers with contested waters and unresolved disputes are watching. They are asking whether the United States truly possesses the political will and military capacity to protect every commercial vessel if this approach becomes normalized. Markets, meanwhile, have already begun to respond in ways that no press statement can counter. Insurance premiums for shipping near Russian-controlled or Russian-adjacent waters have surged. Certain routes have become so expensive to insure that they are effectively unusable. This does not produce an immediate collapse of global supply chains, but it initiates a slow fragmentation. And history suggests that slow systemic breakdowns are often more dangerous than sudden shocks. Companies that believe they had successfully diversified away from Russian dependency are discovering that their alternative supply chains still rely on maritime corridors now exposed to escalating geopolitical risk. Europe, in particular, faces a strategic dilemma, as energy logistics frequently transit zones where control is contested and enforcement boundaries are increasingly blurred. What we are witnessing is not the failure of trade overnight, but the steady erosion of the assumptions that once made global commerce predictable. And when predictability disappears, uncertainty becomes a cost that compounds at every stage of the system. The deepest irony in this entire episode is that the sanctions system designed to isolate Russia has instead created the conditions for Moscow to demonstrate a different and far more disruptive form of power, not the power to outcompete Western financial systems.